cash, Grandma always knew how to give new life to boring ground beef. Her dishes were always spot on, ready to give you the time of your life at lunch. Allow me to let you in on her cooking secrets. Classic 1950s meatloaf. Every Sunday, without fail, Grandma would pull out her metal loaf pan and work her hands through a mixture that seemed almost sacred. This wasn't just any meatloaf. This was the kind that held families together around dinner tables. She'd combine 2 pounds of ground beef with breadcrumbs soaked in milk, 2 beaten eggs, and finely diced onions that she'd cry over while chopping. The secret wasn't in expensive ingredients, but in the way she'd gently fold everything together, never overworking the meat. A glaze of ketchup mixed with brown sugar and a dash of Worcestershire sauce would paint the top, creating that dish that made mouths water from 3 rooms away. The meatloaf would bake low and slow, filling the house with an aroma that meant home. Served alongside mashed potatoes and green beans, this dish represented more than dinner. It was love made edible, comfort served on a platter. But before we move next, if you love nostalgia and classic comfort foods from the past, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon, because I share timeless food memories that you won't want to miss. All right, let's get started. Chili con carne. Nothing said welcome home quite like walking into Grandma's kitchen and smelling her chili con carne bubbling away on the back burner. This wasn't some fancy chef creation. This was the kind of chili that could warm you from the inside out on the coldest winter day. She'd brown the ground beef in her biggest pot, letting it develop those deep, rich flavors before adding onions that would cook until they practically melted into sweetness. The spices came next. Chili powder that she'd buy by the canister, cumin that smelled like earth and sunshine, and just enough cayenne to give it a gentle kick. Canned tomatoes would go in whole, and she'd crush them with her wooden spoon right in the pot, letting their juices mingle with everything else. Kidney beans, sometimes pintos too, would add substance and make the chili stretch to feed however many mouths showed up at dinner time. Hours of slow simmering would transform these simple ingredients into something magical. A chili so rich and complex you'd swear it contained secret ingredients. Served with cornbread for dipping and maybe a dollop of sour cream, this chili was more than a meal. It was a warm hug in a bowl. Tamale pie. Grandma's tamale pie was her nod to southwestern flavors, transformed into something that could feed the whole family from a single casserole dish. This wasn't authentic Mexican food. It was American comfort food, inspired by south-of-the-border tastes. The base started with ground beef browned with onions and seasoned with chili powder, cumin, and a touch of paprika that gave everything a warm, earthy flavor. Canned corn and diced tomatoes would join the party, along with kidney beans for extra heartiness. The whole mixture would simmer until the flavors married together in perfect harmony. But the real star of this show was the cornbread topping. A simple batter made from cornmeal, flour, eggs, and milk that would spread over the beef mixture like a golden blanket. As it baked, that cornbread would puff and brown, creating a crust that was crispy on top and tender underneath. Each serving delivered a complete meal in every bite. Protein, vegetables, and bread, all layered together in a way that made sense to both the stomach and the budget. Beef and rice casserole. Grandma's beef and rice casserole was the ultimate one-dish meal, designed to feed the family while using ingredients that were always available in her pantry. This wasn't complicated cooking. This was smart cooking, the kind that understood that sometimes the best meals come from letting simple ingredients work together in perfect harmony. Ground beef would brown with onions in her skillet. creating the flavorful base that would anchor the entire dish. Raw rice would get stirred right into the beef mixture, along with beef broth that would provide all the liquid the rice needed to cook perfectly. Frozen mixed vegetables would add color and nutrition without requiring any prep work, making this the kind of meal that could come together even on the busiest weeknight. Everything would go into a casserole dish, covered tightly with foil, and baked until the rice was tender and had absorbed all those wonderful flavors. The result was a complete meal in every serving. Protein, vegetables, and starch all cooked together until they became something greater than the sum of their parts. This casserole proved that Grandma understood the secret to satisfying family meals. Keep it simple, keep it delicious, and always make enough for leftovers. Salisbury steak. When times were tight but spirits needed lifting, Grandma would transform ordinary ground beef into something that felt fancy enough for Sunday best. Salisbury steak was her answer to making hamburger feel like a restaurant meal. She'd shape the seasoned beef into oval patties, browning them perfectly in a heavy skillet until they developed that beautiful crust. The real magic happened next, a rich mushroom gravy that would simmer and bubble around those patties, creating a sauce so good you'd want to drink it. Made from the pan drippings, beef broth, and sliced mushrooms that had been cooked until golden, this gravy was liquid gold. The steaks would nestle back into that bubbling goodness, absorbing all those flavors while staying tender and juicy. Served over a mountain of creamy mashed potatoes with the gravy cascading down the sides, this meal could make any day feel special. It was proof that Grandma could take the humblest ingredients and create something extraordinary. Hamburger casserole. Into the same pan would go canned corn, diced tomatoes, and a packet of seasoning that somehow made everything taste like it had been simmering all day. The mixture would get topped with a layer of instant mashed potatoes, spread smooth as frosting on a cake, then sprinkled with shredded cheese that would melt into golden bubbles. 45 minutes in the oven was all it took to create a complete meal that satisfied both hunger and soul. This wasn't just food, it was strategy. Grandma knew that this casserole would provide leftovers for days, ensuring no one went hungry even when money was scarce. Each forkful delivered protein, vegetables, and carbs all in one bite, making it the perfect example of practical cooking that never sacrificed taste. Hamburger chow mein casserole. When Grandma wanted to add a little adventure to the dinner table without venturing too far from familiar territory, she'd whip up her hamburger chow mein casserole. This dish represented the 1950s fascination with international flavors, adapted to suit American tastes and budgets. Ground beef would sizzle alongside diced celery and onions, creating a base that smelled like comfort and possibility. Canned chow mein noodles, those crispy golden tangles that came in a can, would get mixed right in, along with cream of mushroom soup and a splash of soy sauce. The whole mixture would go into a casserole dish, topped with more of those crunchy noodles, and slid into the oven until bubbly. The result was a fusion dish that satisfied the family's desire for something different, while still feeling like home. Each bite offered textures that played together. The tender beef, creamy sauce, and those satisfying crunchy noodles that somehow stayed crisp even after baking. It was Grandma's way of bringing the world to her dinner table without leaving her kitchen. Casserole. When Grandma needed to make dinner happen fast, but still wanted something that felt special, her beef and noodle casserole was the answer. This dish proved that sometimes the simplest combinations create the most satisfying results. Wide egg noodles would go into boiling salted water, while ground beef browned alongside diced onions in her trusty skillet. The smell alone was enough to draw family members into the kitchen, drawn by that combination of browning meat and sautéing onions that meant good things were coming. Once the beef was perfectly browned and the onions tender, cream of mushroom soup would join the party, along with a splash of milk to make everything creamy and rich. The cooked noodles would get stirred right in, along with frozen peas that would add color and a touch of sweetness. Into a buttered casserole dish it would go, topped with breadcrumbs mixed with melted butter that would bake into a golden, crunchy crown. 30 minutes in the oven was all it took to transform these humble ingredients into a casserole that could satisfy the hungriest teenagers and leave them asking for seconds. Beef and cabbage skillet. When fresh vegetables were expensive but cabbage was cheap, Grandma knew exactly how to turn this humble vegetable into something that would make the whole family forget they were eating their vegetables. Her beef and cabbage skillet was a masterclass in making simple ingredients sing together in perfect harmony. Ground beef would start browning in her cast iron skillet while she shredded cabbage into ribbons that looked almost too pretty to cook. The beef would get pushed to one side of the skillet while diced onions cooked in the rendered fat, becoming golden and sweet. Then came the cabbage, piled high in the skillet until it seemed impossible that it would all fit. But Grandma knew that cabbage had a magic trick. It would wilt and shrink as it cooked, concentrating all its mild, sweet flavor into tender leaves that absorbed all the beefy goodness from the skillet. Salt, pepper, and a touch of paprika were all the seasoning this dish needed, letting the natural flavors of the beef and cabbage shine through. Served over rice or with crusty bread, this skillet meal was proof that the simplest combinations often create the most satisfying results. Cabbage rolls with ground beef. Making cabbage rolls was an all-afternoon affair in Grandma's kitchen, but the results were worth every minute of careful preparation. This dish represented the pinnacle of Grandma's cooking skills, the ability to take inexpensive ingredients and transform them into something that looked and tasted like it belonged at a fancy dinner party. Whole cabbage heads would get boiled until the leaves could be carefully peeled away, each one handled like precious silk. The filling was a masterpiece of simplicity: ground beef mixed with cooked rice, diced onions, and just enough seasoning to let each flavor shine through. Each cabbage leaf would get a small mound of filling before being rolled up like a tiny present, the edges tucked in perfectly to prevent any filling from escaping. The rolls would nestle together in a heavy pot, covered with a sauce made from canned tomatoes, a touch of brown sugar, and enough beef broth to keep everything moist during the long, slow cooking process. Hours of gentle simmering would transform these simple rolls into something magical. Tender cabbage surrounding savory filling, all bathed in a rich, flavorful sauce that was perfect for sopping up with crusty bread. Beef Wellington-style loaf. When Grandma wanted to make ground beef feel fancy enough for special occasions, her beef Wellington-style loaf was the perfect solution. This wasn't traditional beef Wellington. This was Grandma's interpretation, designed to deliver impressive results without the intimidation factor of the original. Ground beef would get mixed with breadcrumbs, eggs, and sautéed mushrooms and onions that had been cooked until golden and fragrant. The mixture would get shaped into a loaf, but instead of going directly into a loaf pan, it would get wrapped in puff pastry that had been rolled thin and brushed with egg wash. The pastry would create a golden, flaky crust that made the humble meatloaf look like something from a fancy restaurant.